Very nice to see you again. Thank you very much for coming for yet another talk. You seem to work so hard in this university and in all Chinese institutions, schools and so on. We're very impressed by your very hard work. But maybe you think of my lectures as quite easy and just... You all right? Right. Well, it's in some ways nicer to do it in a smaller room because hopefully you can hear me at the back. Can you hear?
Yes.
Good. Today I want to talk about recording devices and recording in the field. Yesterday, if you remember, I talked about how you record with pencils and papers and writing. But of course there was a revolution in the 19th century, starting about 1830-40, the photographic revolution, which allowed people for the first time in history to move beyond the era of representational arts, as they're called, where you use your eyes and then you make a picture of reality through painting or drawing or writing, to the photographic age. This vast change, which is one of the three or four great revolutions in communications technology, has affected anthropology quite considerably. But the potentials haven't really, as yet, been fully used. And today I want to take you into what I think is one of the most important, significant developments in anthropology, which is the recording revolution using machines. Human beings have good eyesight, but on the whole, you just see the world in one way. And you can't record it. You record it a bit in your mind. All that we see and hear and so on is there, but it's very difficult to take it out, it's very difficult to frame it, it's very difficult to use, and a great deal of the detail is lost, of course. With modern recording devices, you can select what you want to record and then make a more or less permanent record of it. So the first great revolution was the photograph. The next was the moving film in the the first fieldwork anthropological film was made in my university, from my university in Cambridge, when A.C. Haddon went to the Torres Straits off Australia and made the first moving film of a native ceremony in about 1891. So a little over 100 years ago. And then you got sound film. But the second great breakthrough, really, after that, was what has happened in the last 20-30 years with the movement towards digital media. And so I will take you through this later period, from my first field work through to modern filming. It's something which most anthropologists ignore. I was never taught about it, no one mentioned it, my colleagues don't do filming. It's considered to be rather inferior kind of activity. And photography, even photography is not considered really proper anthropology. But I think for students and for yourselves it's terribly important to be aware of the potentials, which is what I'm going to tell you about. I'll start with the other media, audio recording. Can you still hear me if I sit down? It's probably easier for me to operate this. So, as I say there, when we first went to this village, we took a small cassette tape recorder. This had just been invented. It was about this big. And before that, you couldn't have these little cassettes about this big. You probably haven't seen them, but they were a revolution. They took 45 minutes of sound on each side. There were two reasons we took them. One was to record the people themselves, and the other was because you could take some music with you, and listening to classical music when we were in the field was very helpful. I was encouraged to do this because my supervisor, a famous anthropologist who worked in Nepal, Professor Hammondorf, had done a lot of tape recordings in the field. He was in the era when, and so was I at the beginning, when cameras filming, there was no sound on the camera. So if you wanted to put on the soundtrack later, you had to do a tape recording. So he'd done a lot of tape recordings, and he urged me to take a tape recorder, which I did. And here is a list of the bits of sound recording I did in 1969 on the first fieldwork. Tibetan songs while we were travelling up to the village. Me singing some songs with my guitar, a Tibetan woman singing, and so on. Now, this list can be supplemented by, or at least I can illustrate it by going to the early fieldwork materials.
It's the wrong database.
I know.
All right.
Perhaps I ought to explain just briefly what I'm doing here. I'll talk about this more tomorrow. The problem with anthropological fieldwork, as I mentioned towards the end yesterday, is that you come back with masses of material, too much material. Finding your way around that material is very difficult. So you need some database system, indexing system, and this is the one that we use here. It's bad enough after one fieldwork, but you can imagine what it's like after you've been 20 times over a period of 40 years. It's really complicated. And so we have put, or Sarah has put into what we call the bamboo database, all the film, all the photographs, everything we've ever taken. So I'm just going to illustrate as I pass. This is a database system where you can put in some free text, some words, and also specify various fields that you want to search within. So here, to show you a little bit of the sound, I'll go to the early database. This is the 1969 fieldwork. And all I really want to show you is a very simple search. I just want to look at sound. So there are 63, and I'll search by order of date. And as I mentioned, the first bit of tape recording is the night before we arrived in the village. We were staying in a little school below the village, and some Tibetans were there, and they came and said, would we like them to sing for us? So we said yes. So that was the first bit of tape recording I did in 1916. It was 1968, it was the 23rd of December, just before we arrived in the village. Then, that same evening, I said, well, you've been singing for us, would you like me to sing to you? So I had my guitar with me, and I showed you before my guitar and the value of actually being able to do something, communicate in a different way. So this is rare sound recording of Alan McFarlane in 1969 singing to his guitar in the field.
Yes.
Won't you bring me a little water? And so you make up a song, and this is how it goes.
Yes.
Won't you bring me a little water? Slowly stop clapping. Won't you bring a little water now? Won't you bring a little water, Sylvia? Every little once in a while. Oh, do you love me, Sylvia? Oh, do you love me now? Oh, do you love me, Sylvia? Every little once in a while. Won't you bring me to me, Sylvia? Won't you bring me to me now? Won't you bring me to me, Sylvia? Every once in a while. Oh, do you?
As you see, it gets faster and faster.
Every little once in a while. Every once in a while. Won't you bring me to me, Sylvia? Every once in a while. Yeah.
So, funnily enough, as I mentioned in a lecture, when we went back 20 years later, they were still singing this song. And so, some visiting anthropologists would be very surprised to find that the traditional songs of the Gurungs and the traditional folk songs of the Appalachian Mountains in America were the same. Some elaborate diffusionist theory about how the Gurungs had gone to America in the early days. Anyway, so one more example. We recorded some Gurung songs and also language learning. And people asked about language learning. Here is a little bit of our attempt to try and learn Nepali Gurung.
Yes. Latin.
Latin.
Latin. Kinli. Kinli.
Bottle.
Saleh.
Saleh. Matches.
Umala. Umala. Cloth.
Cloth.
Simsa.
Spoon.
Tali.
Bowl.
Tali. Miwa.
Lemon. A small stool.
Bench.
Bencha.
Bata.
Hands.
Bata.
Right, so that language thing actually reminds me that one of the reasons I did that was then we could, when the informant had gone away, we could practice and listen to the pronunciation of various words. So it's quite a useful thing there. Now, several things have happened to tape recordings. Since then. One was that the tape recorders became smaller and smaller, and this is fantastically well illustrated by something I'd never seen before. I came all the way to China to discover that you can get a digital recorder this size, which is recording this lecture, and even perhaps more natty device, which is a USB stick, which is a digital recorder. So presumably whoever owns this will be able to confirm that once you've done the recording, you just stick it in your computer and then take the recording off onto your computer. I mean, this is just incredible. Imagine the size of my supervisor had a machine like this. I had a machine like that. And now it goes like that. So the second thing, of course, that happened is that one of the purposes of recording, which was to make the sound recording to go with the films, was no longer necessary after the digital revolution or the video revolution, which I'll talk about briefly. There's some other very nice little tape sound recording devices here, as you see, more sophisticated ones. One thing just to mention is that because these are so small and so good, there is a temptation among anthropologists, when they do oral history in particular, and other kinds of work, to use these little devices. They're not at all obtrusive, and nervous people who you want to interview, you can just place one of these and say, do you mind me recording it? It's not as intrusive as a camera. On the other hand, it's not nearly as good as a camera. There are still projects in England to make big oral history archives of people just using these things. And I always tell the people, have you really thought about the implications? If you use this rather than a camera, you've lost 2/3 of your information, because it's a speaking face conveys much of the information in a conversation. Also, transcribing material from one of these is extremely boring. You can't see the person, and therefore most of my students who made tape recordings of this kind, as we used to call them, of course they're digital recordings now, never use them. They just sit in boxes, because the thought of 50 hours of this to be transcribed is just too much. So what are you going to do with this stuff? That's what you have to think. Whereas if you make a film recording of an interview, which I'll talk about later, it's fun, it's quite interesting to do, because you're watching the person. Also it's much easier because you can't hear the words, which you can't properly hear on a recording. You can watch the lips, and you can often see what the person is saying. So beware of these devices. So I now want to move on to the next recording device, which is still photography. This was a student. I'll show you first, perhaps, to start off with, just a little bit of film of how Sarah is photographing in the film, in the field. These are, the first one is a set photograph. These are portrait photographs, so the person has put on quite good clothes. But you'll see some other examples of photography. That's my nephew, Shama Gurum, Vikash Gurum. Right. As I say here, my own supervisor, Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf was one of the great photographers in the history of anthropology. His photographs of the Naga peoples are going to be part of the project which we bring to Sichuan, and he took many photographs in all his fieldwork in Nepal and India and elsewhere, thousands of them, and it was this inspiration that helped persuade us and me that photography was important, and I was loaned a photograph on my first trip there.
Or a camera.
On subsequent visits afterwards, we took many photographs. These are the photographs I took in 1969, my index. It's very important, particularly with photography, to keep a record. This isn't a very full record, but of what you're photographing and when you photographed it and so on. And these are the different reels of photographs I took on the first occasion. Now, why do you photograph? You don't just randomly photograph. Photography takes quite a lot of time, and Sarah may have some comments on that because she did all the photography and developing it. At that time, when we did this kind of photograph in the 1990s, you had to, well, it was best to develop your own photographs. You could make several copies. They were higher quality than if you went to a shop. So Sarah not only took the hundreds of photographs, but also developed the black and white ones. And there were several kinds of reason or types of photographs we took, which I can illustrate again from the database. If we go to the later TARC database, this is from 1986 onwards, advanced search. In 1990, photographs, we started to take photographs. Well, yes, in that year we took photographs of, went round the village, taking photographs of almost every villager. I partly got this idea from a well-known American anthropologist, Napoleon Chagnon, who wrote a book called Studying the Yanomami, and in the back of it he's got photographs of everyone in the settlement he lived in. So we thought it would be a good idea to have a photograph of every single person in our community. So when we were working on things, we could look at these photographs. You saw me looking through some of those in one of the fieldwork films. Well, here's the first photograph. We've got higher quality versions of these, of course. This is just for the database. So each of these is tied to a house. House number is there, the original photograph, and so on and so on. So there was a general survey. Now, we photographed each person, but also there are certain people who are photographed a lot, and as a result you can watch their life through photographs. So I'll just give you an example of that. Black and white photographs are not the only kind. We took black and white photographs, which I've already selected, slides, 800 slides, 1600 photographs, 456 colour photographs, and 1,000 digital photographs. So something like 2,500 photographs. And then if I want to look at how one person...
No, don't do it that way. Do it, show it actually as a person. Title is not a good thing for that. All the persons down below the filters.
No,
Filter.
I don't want to do it like that.
Oh, right. Sorry. It'll bring up other Prem Kumaris. That's the point.
That's all right. I've tested it.
Oh, right. Okay.
but I don't want it under a specific date here, but I do want it in date order. So, as Sarah says, there may be one or two other people with the same name by doing it this way, but also if she appears in a photograph with a number of people and she hasn't been indexed.
Well, the problem is that many people have the same name, and this is very difficult to deal with. This is why every person that is photographed has a house number attached to them. And as they move house, you have to change the number, because then the house number refers to the census. So then you can find that person in a census. You've got to have links upon links upon links. Otherwise, it's very time-consuming to follow data, and you lose data.
Right. So we may get a few stray Prem Kumaris, but I know the first ones are the one that I was meaning. This is someone we encountered before, the young girl who appears in several films and the daughter of Dilmaya. And so here is the first photograph of her in 1986. She's just a baby in this photograph, and she's with her mother and a group of other people. And there she is on the left there, Prem Kumari with Dilmaya, 1986. Can't be more than some months old, or
No, a year and a half.
a year and a half old. Yeah. Okay. So we go to the next result, and there she is on the back of her brother. There she is in the same year with her brother there. If we want to move on a little bit, these are all photographs of her. This is the next year. There's a series of photographs. Her brother's killing a chicken and she's just next door looking at it. Sort of 2.5. I got to know her very well, and a lot of my film is about her, so you can gradually watch a growing person. Let's go on to a later point. This is in 1991, so another 4 years on. Me playing with her, and this is the photograph we took each year, the two of us together, just to show our relationship over the years. And so on. So you've got 30, 40 photographs of one person as they grow older. We also, to return to the other purpose of photography, which perhaps can be shown better by going right out of this, and then going back into here. There's a map of the village, and which Sarah constructed, an interactive map, and our house 31 here, where we live. If you click on it, you get some of the photographs, just a few.
Well, you only get when it was specifically taken of the house and nothing else.
Yeah. So there's a photograph like that of the house in 1987. And what Sarah did was a survey of every single house complete survey. So you've got a physical, and this tied up with the map and the people and so on. And when you're writing, it's very helpful to often look at these photographs, and you can see the changing housing structure and so on and so on.
If you go in by this method, then you can, at any stage, pick up other things that happen, for example, on that date.
Yeah, so if you wanted to see, this is the 10th of the 12th.
Here we are. Decided to start on village photographing. I hadn't realised that was there.
So, decided to start on village photographing. We want to photograph as many of the houses as possible to go with the census. That's rather...
It is very... Didn't know it was there.
Before breakfast we did quite a number lower down the village. Then after breakfast we went down towards Uli and photographed Indrid's house. His daughter-in-law had fallen and badly cut her leg. It looked swollen and very nasty. This is from our diary. So you can see the beginnings of a new idea. This is 1987, and then we continued it in 1990 and so on.
But then you can, for example, go down to the person in the house. You see, his daughter-in-law, Dilmaya, is that person. So all the information on that person who has just had a very nasty cut on her leg, and there should be a picture of her there. Number 2 there looks like a photograph. Okay, there she is, the mother in that picture.
So that's the photograph we took on that day, having started.
That's taken a lot later. That's 1989.
88.
Well, the date is 1989. The film number is 88. But that shows how you can link together all sorts of information, follow people, the sort of thing that you do in your mind, you know, when you're thinking about writing and so on, but usually can't do. And the whole idea of the database is to be able to move very fast. You know, you get an idea, you follow it. Get another idea, you follow it. All sorts of trains. There she is again, for example.
The same lady in 1991, 92. What you do in your mind and what you're when you're writing and creating is to move along all sorts of paths. And the more difficult it is to move between paths, the slower your research you become. You don't index your material properly. You can spend hours searching for one bit of information, something you remember someone said or some place you went to and so on. The purpose of this database system, which we're going to experiment with leaving a copy of here, is that you can just let your mind follow any deed you like, just by date, what happened on a day, by a person, and so on. And therefore you can concentrate your efforts on your thinking, on your writing, and just move around. So what is created on this database really is a virtual village. All the different bits of information are indexed together. So those are examples of a few photographs. There's Prem Kumari again, taken at that time, and just older people. We made an inventory of houses, tied them in with the census. Now, just to conclude on photography, we found that people were prepared to be photographed, but there were certain things to avoid. You have to find out what people like to be photographed doing and so on. People tended not to want to be photographed if they were in old and ragged clothes, or if they were engaged in what might be thought to be demeaning, that is, not very good work, carrying heavy loads, for example. Many villagers saw photographs as rather special. They were used to receiving posed photographs done by studio photographers abroad, looking very serious and wearing, as you saw in some of the photographs, standing bolt upright, wearing their good clothes like this, as if they were in a studio. And so if you just went up to them when they were doing something, they'd say, no, no, don't take a photograph of this, it's boring, wait till I put on my good clothes. There was never any idea which some anthropologists have reported that people feel that you are invading them when you photograph them, taking out their soul or doing something like this. And in a small village like this, no one asks for money or anything. But there are problems, and there are certain things that you shouldn't really photograph. As I mentioned, people eating food. They didn't really like it. I mean, in public eating, outside in a picnic or something, that's fine, but in their homes.
But the other reason for doing black and white photographs, firstly, they keep much better than colour photographs. You've probably seen old colour photographs and they have faded really badly. You can hardly see, you know, what is on them. Not digital photographs, but the old sort of colour photograph. But if you do black and white photographs, you can develop them yourself, or I did, and I would take copies for every single person that I ever photographed, so that they would have the photograph themselves. And I could make other copies for them. If they asked me for other copies, then next year I would come with more copies and so on. So you actually returned, if you like, the photograph to them.
This of course has changed. When we first went together in the 1980s and 1990s, people didn't have cameras except us. So it was a big thing. They had relatives abroad and they might like to send them a photograph, or they might like to have a photograph. Several times they had a ritual of some kind. Some old person died, or Dill, my sister, died, and during the ritual they'd like to have a photograph of the person beside the ritual. From, 2002, 2003, everyone has a mobile phone, and many of them now have cameras on their mobile phones, and many people have cameras. So that particular way of reciprocating and giving material to the people is no longer relevant. But for about 20 years it was important. Are there any other things I've missed?
Yep.
Okay, so let's move on to filming in the field. In the year 2000 I made I sat, as you saw yesterday, and put a camera and then just talked about how I had done fieldwork filming over the years in Nepal. I'm not going to show you that film, but I'll leave a copy if you need it, and you can also get it if you go to the internet under my name, go to, as I mentioned, the streaming media service in Cambridge, SMS Cambridge. You can download that film and watch it. But I will talk you through it and then give you some examples of the development of filming. When I first went, cameras were very, very simple and primitive. They just invented a very small 8mm, that's a format of film, film camera, Japanese Konica. And so when I consulted my supervisor, who was a great anthropological filmmaker, one of the greatest in the history of anthropology, he said, no, you can't take film, it's too expensive, cameras this size, until you are a professor or whatever, it's not something you can do as a student. So I didn't take a camera, but fortunately I noticed in the shops in Kathmandu in 1968 they were selling these little Japanese Konica cameras. So just in the last 3 months of my time in the field, I went and bought one in Kathmandu and brought it back and filmed. And here is a log of my movie films taken in 1969, starting off in Kathmandu, and a little girl with Jill tying bangles in Pokhara Bazaar, and then in the village an old lady is sifting rice eating rice, cutting rice down, and so on and so on. So this is a very rough log of that first film here. One of the many problems of this camera and this film in those days was that the difficulty with film is that the only way you can edit film, and I hope you know what I mean by film, a sort of strip of celluloid substance. The only way you can edit it is to cut it into pieces. It may seem very old-fashioned, which it is, but basically you couldn't just copy it and edit it as you can now with digital video. So what I had to do was to take my precious film and reorder it. If I wanted to make a film, for example, about agriculture or social life, I had to first work out, go right through it, index it all on little bits of strips of paper, which you see here, reorder, put the index like that, and then go through the film and cut it into little bits. And then you had a little device which you put the 2 bits of film, and you put some glue, and then you stuck it together, pressed it on together, and then you had a bit of film. Now, of course, you can see this is very time-consuming, very undermining, because your original film has now lost its sequence. But it was the only way you could make up a little bit of film. Also, there were other disadvantages. There was no sound, there was no zoom. The film was pretty expensive, just 3 minutes long. A piece of film was 3 minutes long, and it cost quite a lot of money. And finally you ended up with a little bit of film on Gurung agriculture. I'll show you the quality of it. Not very high quality, or so it seemed, which you could, what could you do with it? You showed it to your family maybe. Later you might show a little bit to your students, but 8mm was quite low quality. My supervisor filmed in 16mm, which is better. So there seemed to be no, it seemed very limited as a device. So, on the other hand, what I've discovered is that, in fact, the quality of the film I took then is much, much better than I thought. Although it's only 8mm, each of the 25th of a second, it goes through 25 frames at a second. Each frame is really pretty good. This is just one frame you have here, 1/25th of a second of a piece of film, of a ritual which I've never been able to photograph or film since then. He's drawing a trident down here. So what I've discovered just recently, when I re-looked at these films and started to analyse them, is that what I was doing was taking thousands and thousands of photographs. As mentioned before, when you photograph, you usually have particular aims, and we photograph mainly people. In my first field work, mainly people, places, and 1 or 2 special events, like a ritual. Everyday events one tends not to photograph, and one is limited, a few hundred photographs. Here I have 3 hours of film from my first field work, of a village that has completely disappeared. 3 hours of film, each second of which is 25 photographs. So you can imagine how many hundreds of thousands of photographs I've got, which I can go through. And why I can do this now is, of course, the computer. You can go through in a way you couldn't do if you were showing a film on a projector. You can now go through frame by frame by frame, selecting interesting frames, and you can do all sorts of things, obviously, with Adobe Photoshop and so on, to improve the quality. So, another reason for your encouraging you to film. You may not even want to make up films or use films, but as a record of small events, because when you're filming, you have a major subject. You're filming someone's life, or you're filming a ritual or something, and you film that. all the time, all around it, thousands of things are happening which we don't really see and which are lost if you haven't got some record of it. But the film captures all those things. So when you go back to look at a subject, you can find all sorts of missing clues. For instance, when I first went, I filmed a little bit in the town in Pokhara, and later I didn't think this was worthwhile. Now when I am thinking about how Nepal has changed in the last 40 years, I go back to that early film I took in 1968, and I can look at the street. I didn't really notice, obviously at the time, how extraordinary it was looking at this street, frame by frame, what the people are wearing, the complete absence of cars, the complete absence of almost anything in the shops, the poverty of the people, and so on. You can see all this frame by frame by frame from these early films, and then tie that up. And the same with later films. So I've got a particular film, which I won't show you, about developing Pokhara, 1969, 1986, 1987, and so on. And looking at them again now and comparing them, you can see all sorts of changes occurring in detail. Suddenly all sorts of medical shops turning up, the first internet cafe, and so on, which you don't really notice but come out in the film. So let me, I'll just see if I can do this. This is a little bit of film, and last year I was asked by an American student whether he could do an interview of me, which will appear in American Anthropologist, I think, just about now. I'm not sure whether they'll have the film as well, but he said he'd like to film me talking about filming and about cameras and so on. So this is in my room in Cambridge, filmed earlier this year, talking about that early film. And why I'm showing you and not just telling you is that you will see the camera I used and get some idea of what it was like and its advantages and disadvantages. This is the camera here, so we'll just see whether it works or not.
Luckily, when I went to Kathmandu in late 1969, already in a shop, there weren't many shops in Kathmandu, but in one of the shops there was a little video, no, not 8mm film camera, which is this camera here, which I saw, although it took a good chunk out of my grant to buy it. I thought I really ought to buy it and buy some film. The film was relatively very expensive. It only lasted 3 minutes, a cartridge. There's no zoom on this, there's no sound on this. But, of course, it is very handy, very small. So, for about the last 3 months, I filmed what I could with this camera. And I'm now looking at this film, and I have about an hour of film I took. This is some of it here. And basically, it's just reels of film. This is about 20 minutes of film. The problem, I just need to get some help. The problem was that not only was it expensive and difficult to use without sound, because I tried occasionally to tape record and then sync them, but that was really complicated. Difficulty was that when you got it home, what would you do with it? The only way to edit it, of course, this is a very simple version of all editing with film at that time, it was to cut it with a device like this, and then using the same device to stick it, little bits together. This is a way of sticking 2 bits of film together. And that meant your original film was broken into bits, and if you'd made a mistake and cut it in the wrong place, that was that. But, all the same, I made half a dozen films 20-minute films or less than that, about agriculture and about religion and about social life and this sort of thing, which I showed to my family, and they all viewed it, said how beautiful. I had to give a commentary over the top. But no one else saw it. I don't think I showed it to Heinrich or anything else. What I realise now, of course, is that I should have taken much more film. It was just a unique opportunity because much of that world that I saw then was gone. And secondly, that even the film now, because of modern technology, is really a whole set of, it's high quality, isn't it, millimeter. You basically got thousands of still images, and
I've said this to you, so I'll stop there, but you saw the sort of camera and the sort of little editor that I used. When I went back with Sarah in 1986, I took the same camera, and for the first 2 trips filmed in the same way, and it has the same limitations. But even that is quite useful, and I'll show you a little bit of the film then. 1988 is the video revolution. I mean, it was earlier, but it came to me in 1988 when I took out my first video camera. The video camera obviously had huge advantages. It took sound, the film was very much cheaper, it was very good in low light, you had zoom, but the first camera's Video 8, as it was called, was still quite a simple form of this. And the other great advantage was that you didn't have to cut up the film. You could edit. You could make a copy of it, kept the original copy, and then you, with the copy, you edited it into different bits and pieces. The main difficulty at that time and for the next 15 years was electricity. I showed you in one of the early films the huge battery we had to take, very heavy, and it only lasted about an hour and a half, 2 hours. And so we had 2 of those, so you had 3 or 4 hours. Now Sarah, with this camera now, is filming 5 hours a day, so that would use up the whole battery that we could take to the village in one day. The really perhaps more interesting thing for you, and we'll go on with the technology later, is what you should film and how you should film it. I remember starting to film in 1988, as I say, and wondering what I should film, because I now had a camera that could film a lot. But what should I film? We'd now got a house in the village, and we were living with Del Meyer. And I could begin to see that film might be useful for teaching students as well as just showing to my family, because it was very immediate, as in your case. And so I first thought, well, I'll just film lots of things, and then I'll take bits out and make a thematic film. The life of the buffalo, for example, or attitudes to death, or how people deal with disease. So these are the kinds of films you watch on television under a particular topic. So as I say, I went round filming a few seconds of this, a few seconds of that. Rather like my early filming, when I had very little film. This film was pretty bad, the first 1988. And when I took it back and showed it to my students, they were not particularly impressed by it. So when I went back in 1990 for a much longer period, or for a longish period, I sat down and I thought about, firstly, how you should film, and secondly, what you should film. And looking through my notes recently, I came across my notes in the village about how to film, and I still think that quite a lot of this is relevant. So I will go through this with you, and it may be useful for you if any of you are thinking of filming. These are various points. And as far as I know, there's no simple summary like this in any book. about fieldwork filming. So I read these notes after watching someone else's film done by a Gurkha officer, that's a military officer. He took film of the similar subjects that those I was taking, and they were awful. The way to see whether you're making reasonable films is to watch other people's films. And if they strike you as much better than yours, you're not doing the right thing. If they strike you as awful, then you begin to get a sense you are doing reasonably well. So, thinking about it, I came up with these points. Unusual angles are important. Human beings can see like this. If you just film like this all the time, it's pretty boring. So, if you watch filmmakers and you watch my films, for instance, you remember those girls dancing with a plate in a ritual, and I was filming like this up them. So do some filming straight on, but try and get above the subject, below the subject, from the side. Take film in all sorts of different angles, and then it will be much more interesting to watch. Cutaways, as they're called, are important. In other words, if you're filming a ritual and the ritual's going on like that, you need to cut away to the audience so people can see the context and then go back. Don't dwell on inactive and uninteresting subjects. If it's just a mountain, don't film it. Boring. Just maybe a little film, but photograph still objects. If nothing is happening, don't waste film on it, on the whole, unless there is a significance in the silence. I mean, there may be a Buddhist monk is doing some chanting, and then suddenly there's a silence, and it goes on for a minute. You may need to film all that, but on the whole, don't film still uninteresting subjects. Use quite a lot of intimate close-ups. If you're dealing with something that is really emotional and powerful, then go up quite close on, for example, on a person's face, because then you can see the expression. In some of the film of Dilmaya, for example, when she was feeling upset at us going, you didn't see it there, but I go right up close, and then you feel intensely the emotion. At the moment, at the beginning I was making jerky zooms. If you zoom, you should zoom smoothly in. And roughly, I worked out that a zoom from far away to close up shouldn't be too fast, and about 10 seconds could elapse while you moved in like that. But remember, I don't mention it here, but if you are zooming, it has an odd effect on an audience. Human beings don't have eyes that can zoom. So the moment you zoom, you start losing your audience. They think, this is odd. This is a machine doing this. It's not me doing it. So if you want to make a point in film, like look at this person, or look at their hands, then zoom. Remember, we don't do that, and therefore use zooms moderately, not too much zooming. Bad filmmakers zoom in and out all the time. Likewise, panning. Panning is going across like that. Bad filmmakers pan too fast, they go whizzing across. Our eyes can't take it in. Imagine if you were looking at a landscape, you don't go like that. You look at it about, at the most at this speed. And you never, hardly ever, if you look at a landscape or anything, go like this. A lot of people, when they film, pan back and forth. You don't want to do that, because we don't pan back and forth. And I've suggested 30 seconds for a pan. I think I mentioned this, but don't move the camera unless it's necessary. There are two kinds of filmmaking. There's the kind where you let the subject dominate. or let the subject be the centre of attention. And that's the kind, this is observational filming, and this is the kind that most anthropologists recommend. We are there to observe them. We are not there to show how clever we are, or to dominate. And therefore we tend to, I tend just to keep the camera still and let the person move. If you watch movies on television and so on, the camera is often whirring round, going round the subject and going here and so on and so on and so on. That makes the camera dominant and the filmmaker dominant. Whereas, unless you need to, just keep yourself still and watch. And then those who are watching your film will be with you watching the events. This is just a tiny point, but when you pan like this, you should get your feet in a position where they are going to end, because if you pan like this, it will get in a very awkward position. So you put your feet like that, and so when you finish the pan, you're facing like that, and you're in a steady position. Tilting is going like that. And it's worth just trying a few, but not too many of those. This problem about focus, I think, has disappeared. I haven't noticed it recently, but in the older cameras, if you just try to zoom in on something, it would go out of focus. And the way to deal with that was to go into the close-up as you want it to end, make it focus there, and then pull back, and it would retain that focus and you could go in properly. Most camera people explain that that actions usually have a rhythm. They start, they reach a high point, and then they end. Someone doing some ritual or whatever goes in that shape. You want to capture the whole thing. Don't cut too soon, just before the climax or just as it's ending. Just allow a little bit beyond that so that you can go back and cut it when you show the film at that point. Make sure you get context establishing shots as well as close and middle shots. If any of you are interested, there is a very good book on anthropological filmmaking written by one of my students, probably the best book on anthropological filmmaking, by Lucian Taylor, Anthropological Filmmaking, or words to that effect, which expands all these points. Something I learnt in the process of filming, I think first in 1990, I was watching a ritual of girls dancing like this, which I've showed you a bit of this ritual, the Gato Sheba. And I found that filming these girls, almost without thinking, I was letting the camera went with the rhythm of the dance, like this. And I had to follow the subject who was dancing in various ways. And I found that this was extremely affecting and moving film, because the person who was watching it felt themselves moving with the rhythm of the dance. So if there is some rhythm in the action, it's sometimes quite a good idea to follow the rhythm. Try if possible to get support for a steady camera. And this raises a larger point, which is the question of tripods. We have a tripod over there, but we don't have a tripod here. Now, if it's a lecture like this, it's fine to use a tripod there. But for fieldwork filming, I say to my students, never use a tripod. Don't even take a tripod, because you might be tempted to use it. This actually is also the advice, perhaps the greatest, arguably one of the greatest anthropological filmmakers, Jean Rouch, accidentally left his tripod behind when he went to the field once, and he realized what a mistake it had been to use a tripod. There are several disadvantages. One is that it frightens people. even a small tripod like that, that's better than that one. But if you have a big tripod here with a camera on and you're talking to someone, they feel really they are in a television studio and there's another person there who's watching them through the lens and so on. With something like the film that Sarah's making, it's not at all threatening. That's one reason. The second reason is that it ties you down. If things are happening and you want to film it, if you have to drag around a huge tripod and place it and get it in position and so on, and it takes time to set up, it's a disadvantage. This is, you're much more mobile. And the third thing, which has never, as far as I know, been pointed out, but I began to realise, is that human beings are not tripods. When we look at the world, we are not steady like a tripod. If you have film on a tripod, it's unreal. It's unreally still. It becomes an artifact, a manufactured thing. Whereas we breathe and we move just a little bit all the time. So our eyes are used to this slight movement. And therefore, if you look film without a tripod, it is realistic. It feels. This is why many avant-garde filmmakers film without a tripod with some simple camera. And I did an experiment to show this to myself, which is that I went up to something which is a very still object, a mountain, the Himalayas, and I filmed them with, just put the camera on a wall and filmed them. And then I filmed them holding the camera like this steadily against myself. And the film that I took against myself was much better. Somehow you thought, I'm looking at this mountain, and a human being is looking at this mountain. On the wall it felt as if it was a machine looking at the mountain. So I advocate. On the other hand, you mustn't wobble around too much. I mean, human beings don't like watching film where it's jiggling around all the time. So what I'm suggesting here is that you find something steady, a wall to lean against. You just go and stand against a wall and that steadies you, and then film. Or you put your camera, you can put your camera on a wall in front of you, or you can, if there's nothing there, just hold it very firmly against yourself and watch. In the old days, you saw me with that early camera going like this. This is something I used to stress, but is no longer so necessary to stress. In the old days, the cameras were like this. Now, if you go and talk to someone and say, "Can I film you?" That's a shoot. They think, "Oh God, he's got a gun. He's going to shoot me." Whereas if you do what Sarah's doing, you have the camera, you have a little flip-up thing, and look at that occasionally, but have eye contact with the person, then it's a natural relationship. So the first video cameras had this very small thing which you had to flip up and you had to look down into it when you were filming, like that. Later, you've got this great advance in having a flip-out thing. Keep a good distance from subjects and use zoom if necessary. Remember the power of the camera, both the sound and the film. Many people don't want you to come and stand like this. This young lady is retreating very fast. But the camera can do that. So you stay here and take the camera to here and watch close up. And if they're very nervous, and you can be standing here and filming like this. So keep a reasonable distance and use the zoom if necessary. Make sure that the persons tacitly, explicitly give permission, if not close friends and family. This is a whole other chapter, dimension. This is something I probably will discuss tomorrow morning, because I haven't had time to talk about ethics, the ethics of fieldwork and ethics of filmmaking. Informed consent and the whole question of ethics, which is particularly important in filmmaking, which is a very powerful medium. deserves more attention. So I'll just mention it in passing. If you are filming one or two individuals and you don't know them well, say, would you mind me filming you? They'll almost always say yes. In theory, you should also, if you're going to get their informed consent, you should say, you realise that I am going to put this onto YouTube, or I'm going to show this to my students, or whatever purpose you're going to do the filming for, and they will say, yes, that's okay, or no. Obviously, if you were filming a situation like this, I can't go around each of you saying, may we film this lecture? So Sarah didn't ask when she filmed round here and so on, whether each of you minded being filmed. But we take it tacitly that it's okay with you. But this whole question will come up again tomorrow. I've already mentioned don't waste too much on still objects. Try some diagonal tilts, go like that occasionally. Alternate zooming in and pulling out. Pulling out for surprise. You use the pull-out zoom. You know, you're focused on the subject and you think it's one thing, and then you pull out and you see it's something entirely different, or in a funny place or whatever, and that gives you a sense of surprise. If you zoom in, it shows, look at this. This is an intention, making explicit the intent of your filming. Before a major event starts, find a really good position. Once something starts, it's too late. So find a good high point or clear space where you can watch the action. When filming in by artificial light, think about the exact position in relation to the lighting. All this has changed because in the early days, with the earlier cameras, they could pick up fairly well. Now, this digital camera that Sarah's using is absolutely amazing in low light. So, if a child was working by candlelight, their homework, this camera would easily pick it up. The earlier cameras did a pretty good job, but it's not such a crucial matter. Obviously, always make sure you've got spare film. In those old days when you had cassettes, always carry the camera in the case. Several times I've dropped a camera because I'm just carrying it in my hand. Remember to turn it off, and so on. If subjects are suspicious or threatened or distressed by the filming, stop immediately. This is a question of ethics, as I mentioned before. Make sure that people are not upset. If people start talking about each other or some kind of gossip, be very careful of that, because you may record material and then later replay it to someone else and you are overhearing dangerous information. Work out where the most interesting sounds are and position the camera. Batteries. Some of this is now no longer necessary. Sometimes you use the macro to go in on very small things. Concentrate on a few individuals over a series of activities, but I'll talk about that more in a minute. Frame the subject so there's not too much around it. Though later, all this is changing, because now, of course, with modern editors, if you've made, the subject is just there and you've got a whole lot of space around it, you can now, in the editing phase, cut the bits on the side and just have the central bit. This is quite important. Don't rehearse or go through something before. This will come up if I have time to talk about interviewing. When you do an interview with someone, they say, well, can you tell me what I'm going to you're going to ask me what questions and so on and so on, you should say no. I want the freshness of what you think. I learned this particularly when I worked for the television company on that series I showed some of you. The person who was directing it and producing it would get me in front of whatever it was, a Nepalese rice field, and then he would ask me a question. He hadn't told me what the question was before, and I would have to think off the top of my head what my answer was. If he had told me 10 minutes before, I had been working out a complicated answer and so on, it wouldn't have been spontaneous when I talked about it. This I practice now with the long interviews I do of distinguished anthropologists and others, which I'll talk about later. Don't worry if a European wanders into a picture. You saw me dancing with a European girl in one case. You always use manual focus. That is probably, I now use autofocus a lot. But that doesn't really matter. If a really first-rate sequence, hold on to it and don't worry if it goes on a long time. And so on. Now, only for time. I think, yes, perhaps I'll just go on a little bit more. This was written at the same time, and it was a plan for really what you are seeing, you've been seeing in the last few days. I thought I would make a film portrait of a diary of a Himalayan village. This was, what, 24 years ago, which would go with a book, a series of short windows into the world of the Gurungs. And I would make it under various themes: society and the individual, which is childbirth, infancy, childhood, economy and change, mentality, morality and religion, and above all, what I decided, and was just noted at the end there, was that for people to be interested in what I was filming, it was important to have a particular subject or a particular emotional relationship with the people you're filming. So around 1990, I said, well, we're living with this family. Let me make their life the focus of my filming, and in particular little Maya, my sister, and her little daughter, Kumari. And so I started self-consciously concentrating on their relationship to each other, the whole family, and particularly Dilmaya. And so the films became a biography. This is often a very good way of filming. A lot of well-known anthropological filmmakers have made biographies of people. I possibly partly got the idea from an ex-Cambridge anthropologist who became a filmmaker, Melissa Llewellyn Davis, and she made a famous series of film called Diary of a Maasai Woman, in which she interviewed this particular woman a number of times. Now I thought, well, if I could do a diary of Dilmaya, but not just interviews, I had the opportunity each time I went back to live her life with her. So I would interview her, as I did a number of times, but also go with her to the fields, go with her to dances, to rituals, and so on. And as I mentioned in another lecture, the result is a book, which will be a film book like this, on the life of a Himalayan woman. And that makes it much easier, partly because the subject, in the case of Dilmaya, knows what you're doing and doesn't act, but can make the filmmaking much more profitable interested. She very soon picked up that I was trying to film the processes of life in a Himalayan village. So when she was doing something, she would make sure that she was at the right angle to the camera, that she was doing it not too fast, that if necessary she explained what she was doing. So she started a collaborative enterprise with me. I was the cameraman, but she was the subject. And so she was herself acting as the informant and the gateway into the society, and I was filming this. And it's very unusual to have that opportunity, but a few filmmakers have, and if you can do that, it's really wonderful. So, this is a rough list of the films I took in that year when I outlined what I was doing. So, the real one is 90 minutes. On the 12th of January, you need all the dates as I mentioned: a path to Siklis, thatching, tea houses below Ta, a dance at Songda for the building a new house, walking up to Siklis, cutting up a buffalo, crossing the bridge, and so on, this 16th of... So this is an index which would go into... now, even with a good indexing system like the one I showed you, you can go through it, you can ask to see the films on this date or of this person or whatever. But there are limitations to that way of looking at film. Other things that have developed which are enormously helpful, one of them is to be able to hold all your films so that you can very quickly look at all of them. There are lots of programs which you can now get. This is, I've forgotten what the name of this one is. I think it's called it's not iMovie, but Movie Pro or something like that. A very cheap program which I bought.
iView.
Sorry?
iView.
iView, that's right. iView Pro. And each of these is a sequence of film. These are the films which were taken, part of the film was taken in 1 year in this village. I don't know if you want to explain how you index.
I did before, actually.
Okay. Well, basically, the film comes in a long stream, as you saw, different series, and then you have, within an hour of film, a number of sequences, and it's very easy to see where they begin and end. And so Sarah, when we come back from China now or at any other time, will go through the film and cut it into sequences. Each of these is a sequence. Of course you can and do keep the original film as well, but you cut it into sequences like this and make it into a digital version, which is high quality, original quality film, and a compressed version, the current standard being MPEG-4. And so each of these is a sequence, and I can just go through very quickly with my eye and see this is a sequence of an interview, or this is a sequence of children playing in the... if we increase the size a bit, you can see it perhaps a bit better. So this is clearly a basketball game, basketball match, starting roughly here, probably, and ending here. Each of these has a number. So if I was making a film on sports and games in a village, I would note down the first number here, the end number here. I'd go to the original digital video folder, get those films out, put them into an editor.
These actually are the DVs.
These are the digital
Yes,
videos.
so this is the original film, so you could just lift this into a timeline.
Yeah. So I can't, this is just a photograph of it obviously, but if this was the real thing, I could click on this and, or as Sarah says, copy and paste this original film straight into my editor.